Welcome back everybody on the last video about the bishop takes c6, d takes c6 Rossolimo. In this video we're going to be covering the main line, which is really the variation I think you're most likely to face if you go for the Rossolimo as white. Once again, it starts after bishop g7 in this position, h3, and here knight to f6 for black rather than the moves knight h6, b6 and e5 that we've looked at so far. And after knight f6, white generally goes knight to c3. You can already see it's a slightly different way of playing. White's no longer aiming to put the knight to c4, rather just develops the knight to c3. And here black already has two major options, and we're going to start looking at the move knight to d7, which is played because black is intending to go e5, knight f8, knight e6 right away. So he's prioritizing this plan over castling and bringing his king to safety. We should react by playing bishop to e3, e5. If black tries to castle now, which is kind of inconsistent, white is simply better by playing queen d2, bishop to h6, and depending on your style, which is kind of a interesting thing we will see later in this video as well, you can go long castle and follow by h4, h5, which I would probably recommend in this specific case. You can also go short castle and transpose the lines that we'll see later in this video. Anyway, it is not very consistent for black to go for short castle if he has already played knight d7 here. So most black players will go for e5. After queen d2, h6 is the given move. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to allow bishop h6 in these structures. As I said before, it's always kind of a question whether this bishop is good or not. The bishop on c8 is always a little bit a late bloomer in these kind of structures, as it doesn't have too much of a function up until the point that maybe the position opens up a little bit more. But the reason that black generally doesn't want to allow bishop h6 here is simply because of the king's safety. It's not necessarily that the bishop on g7 is a great piece, but since black is sort of bound to castle short here, he should probably prevent that move, bishop h6. So h6 is the main move, and white plays short castle. And black goes queen to e7. Taking care of the c5 pawn, so we can now go knight f8 as black, and at the same time clearing out the way for perhaps a potential long castle in some scenarios, but mostly it's just developing the queen rather than playing b6, which should be preferred. So knight h2, and here we see actually the start of a new plan for white. As you can see, we are no longer really have very easy play on the queen side. So white plays knight h2, basically preparing f4 right away, and the reason we're going for this breakthrough is because black still has the king in the center in this case. Normally it would be a plan that we would prepare a lot more, but here we have to act accordingly to our opponent's strategy, which means that we should not wait for him to play the knight to e6 when f4 is a lot less strong. So knight f8, and as I said, we're just in time with this move. E takes f4, bishop takes f4, and black has two options here. The first one will be g5, bishop to g3, knight g6, which is a slight change of plans for black, but also maybe interesting because we've played f4 and the position has changed a little bit. But I think here the move e5 gives white a very promising position, and it's based on some tactical ideas. First of all, we will see this idea of e5 in many variations. If black just castles over here, we go rook e1 supporting the pawn. Most likely it's already not possible to take because white would simply increase the pressure on whatever piece comes to e5, and it will be hard to defend for black. And after bishop to e6, knight f3, white is now in good shape to just continue with knight e4, knight f6 or knight d6, and black doesn't have a whole lot going for him here, so white should be a bit better. This is the game Adams, Michiels, Baden-Baden 2009. By the way, Adams is a really good player if you're interested in some of the more positional games here. He's been very successful with all of these lines that we've been discussing. So more interesting is the move bishop takes e5 over here, going back to this point. After bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, white should play knight to e4, and here there's a few tactics working in white's favor. So after the move f5, which looks kind of strong at first because it's kicking our knight back, we can actually play queen to c3, which is a very nice move, attacking the c5 pawn. But of course the question is, why can't black just take on e4? After rook e1, we've now prevented black from castling, and we're planning to get our piece back, or at least increase the pressure on the e-file by playing rook takes e4. And actually seems like black can't really hold on to his piece. One of the ways to defend on the e-file would be king d8 and rook e8, but as you can see, after rook to e1, we're simply regaining the piece on e5, leaving us with a very good position. So this doesn't really work, and that's why g5 is actually not played very often anymore. Instead, the move knight e6, sort of consistent with the previous plan, is the main line, and here white should play bishop to g3. Now, this is a very interesting positional struggle because black clearly has to think about what to do against e5 and knight e4. And he has several tries here, but none of them seem to me like really fully equalizing. So we'll have a look at black's options. First of all, he could go for queen g5, but we don't have to exchange the queens, which probably not be a very good thing for white here. We can go queen e1 and continue with e5 and kick the queen out with knight f3 afterwards. So knight d4 is the main move. Here we play e5, and here black has several moves at his disposal. One of them is the move bishop to f5, which would be kind of a logical move, just developing a piece. But here rook to e1, and after long castle or short castle, I don't think it really matters in this case, white will go knight e4, and black can give up the bishop. I mean, in fact, he should probably do so because he's put the bishop on f5 for that purpose, but it doesn't really equalize because white still has a nice sort of outpost here on e5, and we can temporarily distract our bishop away from the e-pawn, but once again, taking it is normally not really an idea, as the piece in question just gets under huge pressure, and normally white regains the material. But also in this type of position, white remains ahead because he can start thinking about setting up an initiative against the king by playing on the queen side. And it's hard for black to generate a whole lot of play against the e-pawn or on the king side for the moment. So this is a bit better for white. Going back to sort of the position where black has several options, which was this one. Another way for him to play would be short castle. And after the move knight to e4, bishop f5, here we see some nice attacking play by white, knight to g4. And after taking, knight to f6 check is very strong. D takes e4, of course, also still we keep some attacking potential, but knight f6 simply works here. You don't really want to give up the bishop on f6 because that would leave your pawn on h6 unprotected, and probably a mate would follow very soon. So black has to sort of move his king, and we can take back with the knight on e4. And once again, we see a position where black can't really take on e5. It's very hard for him to play around that pawn, and white keeps some attack going as his king is now on the king side. We can simply continue our play on the king side and play rook e1, knight f6 back, or knight d6, and so forth. So actually, this is one of the reasons why this variation is not that great. I haven't faced it myself, and I honestly think that theoretically speaking, not too much has happened here in recent times, and it is not a very good idea for black to go for the knight d7 variation. That's why I would advise black players to just opt for the move short castle, and I do think this is the most likely move to face. Here it's really a matter of taste, which move you would prefer. I've spent a lot of time analyzing this position, and for those of you who've seen games in this type of position, it's very possible that you like the idea of playing bishop f4 or bishop e3. Both of these moves are very playable, and some strong players prefer it over the move short castle that I'm going to suggest, which is much more positional. But for example, bishop to e3, b6, queen d2, and here e5 is a good move because after knight takes e5, knight takes e4, we regain the material, so it's not a big deal, kind of like in a King's Indian. And white can go bishop to h6 and decide to castle queenside here. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to castle kingside after this because black has managed to play e5 in one go, when normally he has to go knight d7 and then do another, follow up with another maneuver, either back to f6 or to f8, whereas now actually the knight is quite well placed on f6, where it can go to h5 in case white castles short. So you really have to be consistent here and go queenside castle. And like I said, it's an interesting way to play, but I think it's not necessary. Also, I don't really think it plays into the sort of positional advantage that we've gained from the opening. These double pawns are quite suitable to get pushed up the board here on the queen side. So like I said, there's nothing wrong with it. I just prefer the more positional move short castle over here. So we'll be looking at that one in this video. And take note of the other option, bishop to f4, which is kind of similar to bishop e3, but there are some subtle differences you might want to investigate. So short castle, this is also the way that Mickey Adams, one of my favorite players in this variation to follow, tends to play. White is still mostly aiming to wait for black to play his move e5 and then follow up with ideas related to f4 as we saw in the previous variation. Here black has several moves. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them in this video, but I do suggest that you would look them up in the ebook. First of all, I would say we should look briefly at a move like queen to c7 just because it's preparing e5. Here I would suggest you go a4. a5 is kind of the standard move by now. And bishop to e3, b6, knight d2 is kind of a typical way that we would probably place our pieces in a variation like this. Black might save a little bit of time not having to play knight d7 and so forth if he can play e5 in one go by just supporting it with his queen, but obviously our idea would be to go f4 and gain a tempo on the queen in case he takes, and it does look quite scary for black to allow f5, which would perhaps even result in some sort of pawn storm on the king side. So once again, this is just pleasant. These types of positions we'll see some more of, but here everything is sort of coming with a tempo for white, and he can have very free piece play over here and just a very pleasant position. So queen c7 is not really played, but it's more to indicate what white's plan would be. One of the moves could be to play e5. This somehow doesn't strike me as a very logical move, but I've faced it myself, and after that I've seen someone else play it as well. It's kind of a pawn sacrifice basically, because after knight takes e5, knight takes e4, we have that typical trick that I was talking about before, except that after knight takes e4, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, white is up a pawn. It reminds me somewhat of a Marshall attack or some sort of variation in the Spanish where sometimes black is able to give up some material for activity and a bishop pair. But here I don't think that he has a very good version of it, and I would suggest after the move queen to d5 to go back to e4, f5, and here you can play the way that I played, which is knight c3, and honestly I won the game and thought I was a little bit better all along. But also knight g5 is a very natural move, planning to get the knight back to f3 and then maybe support the move d4 later on. And as I said, this move has been played, but I don't really see the big idea behind it. It seems like black is in a slightly worse position for many moves to come. So e5 is not something to be really worried about. It doesn't require a whole lot of knowledge either. More interesting is probably just the move knight to d7, which is originally the main line. And here we continue with bishop to e3, e5, and queen d2, so we're sort of planning to go to h6. Here rook e8. Take note that it makes sense for black to play like this now, first of all because at least we've castled, so if we do get to exchange the bishop on h6, which we might very well go for in some cases, at least he doesn't have to worry about us shoving up our h-pawn to h5 and start some kind of kingside attack with a rook on h1. So in this case it makes sense for him to go for this. Also he could potentially consider ignoring or preventing the exchange if we go bishop h6. Knight h2 is the right move in this kind of scenario just because knight to g4 can be an interesting option, and knight d2 would be a nice square for the knight, but in this case I would suggest putting your queen there because we also want to have access to these squares with our bishop. The move b6 and queen e7 have both been played here, but for example queen e7, bishop h6, bishop to h8 as I said is possible, and here king h1, and you can see that the type of play is a lot slower than almost all the variations we've seen before. I really enjoy this type of position because white can simply go rook to e1 and really play f4 whenever it suits him. Of course there's this one idea that we have to look out for, which is knight f8, knight e6. As soon as the knight gets to e6, it's not very favorable for us to play f4 because we would have to give up the bishop for this knight. So after, for example, knight f8, now would be the right moment to play f4. And in a position like this, which is probably very common in this variation, I've seen these type of positions appear a lot, I simply think that white has the upper hand. He has very easy play, he can get the knight back into the game, create some chances against black's king, and black is by no means lost, but I do think that white can be very happy with the outcome of the opening here. So this type of position that I would probably aim for as white. This variation requires a little bit of more concrete knowledge in the knight d7 variation that we covered at the beginning of the video, but this type of position you can honestly play quite easily without remembering the precise details of it all. There's one more move I would like to pay a little bit of attention or bring to your attention, which is not knight d7 but the move knight to e8, which I faced most recently when I lost the game to Dutch Grandmaster Dimitri Reinderman, who is actually an expert in this system. It's a very interesting idea because, and something that has not really surfaced in the top level chess, at least not at the times that this line was very popular. I really like the idea for black because he's planning to play knight c7, knight e6, kind of the standard maneuver, but he doesn't necessarily need to play e5 to get there. So honestly, it seems like a kind of a hybrid form of the original plan, which might very well be better. However, after the move bishop e3, b6, queen d2, I think we should stick to our normal plan. Black could go for knight c7 here, but I don't think that it necessarily gives him a great position if we just exchange the bishops and go for our usual play. Also, as you can see, he can't play e5 right now, so this would only really make sense if he can get the knight on e6 in time to stop f4, but since he can't play e5, it's not that dangerous for us. So e5 now would make sense. Still, he might save some tempo compared to having to put the knight to f8 and then to e6. And here bishop h6, f6, knight h2, and we see kind of a similar position appear. For example, here you can go takes, and f4, but I also like the waiting move b3, stopping any c4 ideas, which is something we haven't really seen too much of, but it can be an idea sometimes, especially when the bishop comes to e6, to get rid of the doubled c-pawn. And after a sequence of these moves, something like this all seems very logical, and again f4, I think white is again having a slightly better position. So this about covers the main line of the Rosolimo. I hope that the ideas are clear to you. I think that the general tendency in this variation is to have a good overview of all black's options. Regardless of whether you play it as white or as black, I think it's very important to understand why certain setups are good or bad at certain moments, and why white should prevent certain maneuvers, and why he can't or shouldn't necessarily spend time preventing others. This is really the reason why theory has sort of moved towards this setup for black, especially the two first videos hopefully explain that to you a little bit more in detail. And yeah, I hope that you get the chance to try some of these ideas in practice. Once again, I do think that this is very pleasant for white to play if he understands these positions well and knows how to get here. And I hope you're enjoying the repertoire so far. In the next videos, we're going to be looking at different lines like b takes c6, and